Hi, everybody. I'm Madison. I'm the program manager here for the Quick Suite Learning Series. And today we have three special guests. So we have Andy, Josh, and Ray with us. They're all solution architects on the Amazon Quick Site team. And we're going to be covering a deep dive with them on three capabilities within data prep. So we're going to cover ListAGG, Pivot, and Unpivot. And with that, I'll pass it over to you guys if you want to introduce yourself.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Ray Sanchez. I'm a solution architect with QuickSuite.
Hi, everybody. Name is Andy Sun. I'm also a specialist solutions architect for QuickSuite as well, based out of Phoenix, Arizona.
My name's Josh Anderson. I'm a senior special solution architect on the same team, based out of Seattle, Washington.
All right, excellent. So I'm going to go over the agenda here really quick. So today we're going to start off with a quick recap of the new data prep as an intro. And then we'll dive into the ListAGG function, followed by the pivot, and then the unpivot function. And at the end, we'll open it up for some Q&A. Okay. So the QuickSuite recently launched the new data prep experience. And with this, it provides an intuitive visual interface that enables users to create analysis-ready data sets without SQL experience. Some of the key features, we can go ahead and click. Some of the key features that this includes is that visual workflow with some drag and drop capability and a transformation builder with a real-time preview that allows users to track step by step from the raw data to the final output, as well as compare before and after transformations. Additionally, with these transformations, provided we do have the pivot and unpivot, as well as the ListAGG we'll be covering today, but append and join as well, and allows to refine the data set with filtering, aggregation, and calculated columns, as well as some advanced features such as divergence. So you're able to create multiple paths from different steps, as well as create composite data sets. So all in all, this allows for real-time feedback on every transformation, allows to clean, structure, and enrich the data visually, and create and enable meaningful business insights faster.
All right, I think that's my cue. I'm going to talk about the ListAGG functionality, which is the first one that we're diving into. So this is super cool. It allows us to do string aggregation very simply. This is a deeper SQL function traditionally for users to get into. If you've used systems like Oracle or Postgres, you might be familiar with string agg, or it might be called group concat in MySQL. But this allows us to pull together strings of data from multiple rows into a single field of data, and we can determine how we want to separate that as part of this process. We do this all visually. It's very accessible for anybody, whether they have SQL or not, to be able to click through these transformations. We do have two different variants of this function. We can get all of the values into a concatenated group within one row, or we can just grab the distinct values into a group. And there's different use cases for each of those. Benefits here is this is very simple and easy. It gives you some very valuable insights rapidly. This is a deeper SQL functionality. I know people who use SQL for years who never get into these. So surfacing this through this ease of access is a very powerful transition for this tool. Let's go ahead and click on to the next piece. There we go. So we do have a few different supported data types, primarily strings, but it also works with dates. One thing that I'll say, and I'll show you here in just a moment, is a lot of the data types, if you're using this type of functionality, you can always cast them as a string or transition them into a string field very quickly before you begin to use this type of group aggregation. So common use cases here is we might want to consolidate product names used by a single customer into a field. Others is we might want to check the status or the status timeline of a ticket or an opportunity. We might have summarizations of dates within a report, or just simply adding a list of tags or categories to a comma separated item. We do have the ability to separate these by comma, dash, semicolon, or vertical line right now. These are all built right into the system. And I'll show you how we use them in just a second. I think we have one more slide here before we dive in. I'll go ahead, click one more time. There we go. So in the screen, we'll click through all of this, and it's just going through how we hit the group by phases. We would pull up a data set, select the group by and our dimension, and then configure out our values. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the demo real quick. So I'm going to take over the screen share for a second. And I'm looking at a data set called FAA flight data. So this is a public data set available online. And it goes through every flight that occurred in North America or that's regulated by the FAA for a long time. If I come in to edit this data set, in my preview, you'll see a ton of lines of data. Every line of data represents a different flight line. If I go to aggregate this data, I have a few different options here. I'm going to try to aggregate to say how many flights are going out of each city. And I can do this by coming into origin. There's my origin city. And I'm going to add a calculation field. In this case, let's just pick any from the list. I'm going to go destination. Or let's see how many cities this origin flies to. So I can say count and destinations. Now, when I go to preview, I'm going to get some big numbers for every city because it's going to count every single value within this list. So here's my destination airports. I have this many destinations out, but 110 is an unreasonable number here. So if I click back to configure, I can always go distinct to get that distinct count and preview again. But the follow-up question anybody's going to ask is what cities are in this list? So if I come back to my configure, and you'll notice I don't need to remove this initial aggregation. I can go destination again and pick my ListAGG or my ListAGG distinct from this list. Now I'm going to jump right to distinct because I want distinct destinations. I'm going to make it comma separated. And I'm going to say airports. And when I switch back to my preview now, you'll see my origin. Again, I still have my counts because I can have those multiple aggregations stacked, as well as my destination airports. And these are listed out clearly. If I didn't do the distinct here, you would see these airports repeated as many times as they occurred. In this case, I can see that we have 58 here. This is going to be a long, distinct list. Switching to another use case, diving in a little bit. So in this case, in my original data set, my days of week are determined as a number. So they're listed with 1 through 7, with 1 being Monday. So when I tried to build that aggregation, it was not allowing that ListAGG because it didn't support that number field. But very quickly, I converted this over to a day of week using a add calculation inside of Quick Suite's data prep, another feature that we've added inside of this experience. And now I can build my day of week function to say, I want to look at what days of week a flight goes from one destination or from one origin to one destination. And when I click into my preview, what I expect to see is an origin airport, a destination, and what day of week it's coming through. Now, in this case, we're seeing a lot of Sundays because I'm doing a preview of this data. But if I was actually planning out or looking at routes on a larger data set, then I would be able to use this within the entire region, select my data, and see exactly what days are coming through. There's lots and lots of use cases for this. Everything from tracking statuses or classifying items, displaying items within a report, or building lists within a dashboard. I'm happy to discuss this more in questions in a little bit and to do some follow-up here, but I think it's time to transition on to the next speaker. Oh, one pro tip before we move completely past it at the bottom is this can be used to significantly reduce the number of rows in your data set. which is a huge value here depending on how your data set is oriented. Let's go ahead and keep pushing past.
Cool. Thanks for that, Josh.
Mhm.
All right, so I will be covering the pivot transformation step in the new data prep experience. Let's first talk about what is a pivot, right? So it's exactly as the name implies. You are pivoting your table, turning it so that it's able to be easily comparable, right? So the pivot step transforms your row values into unique columns so that you're able to turn your data from a longer format into a wider format. How it works is you'll first select a pivot column. So this is going to be the categorical field whose values will become new columns, right? So in the example below, you can kind of see the pivot column that we're going to choose is the scenario field. And we're basically pivoting on that field so that all the row values within that column become new columns that we can then leverage for analysis. Step 2 will be to enter the actual pivot column row's value and what the output column header would be. So in this case, it will be actual, budget, and forecast. And then the third step will be to select which group by columns you want to include with the new data set, right? So these are going to be the new group by columns that you will essentially add on to your post pivot transformation step. So in this case, account and the month field here. With the pivot transformation, I would say this is something that is used in unique scenarios, right? You wouldn't use this all the time. Some of the ideal scenarios you would do this transformation step is one, the consumer expects a cross-tab view, right? They want the data set to look exactly how a pivot table would look like ultimately. So if you wanted to transform your longer table into a wider format so that's easier to report on, that would be one ideal scenario. The second is if you want explicit named measures, right? So this is super powerful for people that you want to enable to build dashboards and visualizations more easily, and they don't have a lot of BI or SQL experience, right? Because typically business users think in columns, not categories. So if you're able to pivot your table and have these explicitly named measures, it will become much easier for a regular business user to build visualizations by simply dragging those explicit columns instead of having to kind of build out the filters, calculate fields, any sort of conditional logic that a more BI savvy person could do, right? And then the third will be if you need column level logic or permissions, right? So say, you want this wider table, but some fields you want to limit, might have some sensitive data and you want to limit per user or per group. Pivoting your table to have these new columns will enable you to explicitly define those column level security permissions much easier. When should I not use pivot? So I would avoid pivot when you are cleaning or normalizing your data. I would use unpivot or filter, which we'll get into after this a little bit more. I would also avoid it if your data is obviously already wide and meaningful for analysis. So if your data is already wide, there's no reason to pivot it. You can just use it as is. And then the third will be if your end users are more BI savvy, they're capable of actually performing the calculated fields and filters to get the desired visual output they need. Mostly because pivot kind of sticks you into kind of this rigid box. So it's used for very specific scenarios, which I'll show you right now. Let me go ahead and share my screen and walk through a very simple demo of pivot here. Okay. So this is the data set that we're working with, right? So it's a long table. There's only 3 rows, but in terms of structure, it's long. And what we want to go ahead and do is pivot the scenario column. So that way we have explicit columns for actual, budget, and forecast so that we can more easily analyze it, right? We can do comparisons on the visual side. We can do easier calculated fields, such as taking the actual and subtracting budget from it, for example, a lot of different ways in which pivot can help in this situation. So the first step you would do is up here, in this little plus button, you can add another transformation step, and I'll select pivot. And from here, super easy to configure. Like I said before, you'll select your pivot column. So in this case, the column that I want to pivot on is the scenario field. And then once I select that, it'll prompt you to enter which row values you want to be new columns, essentially, as well as what should the new column header or name should be, right? So in this case, actual is a row value I want as a new column. You'll see it also default to using that same row value as the column header. You can obviously change that if you want, but in this case, actual works here. And so I'll add 2 more for budget and forecast. And then once I do that, the next step is to select the value column. So basically what value should be under these new column headers, right? So in this case, I want amount because that's the measure that I want for the actual and the budget and the forecast. And so I'll select amount here. And then you can also select the aggregation function. So if you wanted to get the average, if there's multiple rows with multiple actual values, if I wanted to get an average of that, I can do so. Here's a list of different aggregate functions you can leverage. But in this case, I'll use sum. And then I can also select the group by columns. So which columns do I want to be included in this new data set as well? So account and amount and month are 2 fields that I want to include as well. So I'll select those 2. And then once I configure that, I can go ahead and preview it and show you what the ultimate output of the pivot does here. We'll give that a second. So you can see once it renders here, we can see the preview of the output. So now you can see those 3 rows have been pivoted to a wider table. And so now we can see new columns for actual, budget, and forecast, which now makes it super easy for a business user to build a visualization against it, create new calculated fields against it for easy comparisons. And so with that, I will transfer it over to Ray, and we'll talk about the opposite of pivot, which is unpivot.
Thank you, Andy. And yes, so next we're talking about unpivot, and as mentioned, this is the opposite of the pivot. So what the unpivot step does is that it transforms the columns into rows, converting wide data into a longer, narrow format. This type of transformation helps organize the data that is spread in multiple columns into a more structured format that is typically easier for analysis and visualization. The way this works is that the column headers will be converted into the row values, and it does this by creating 2 new columns automatically. So one will be for the former column name. So this will get our category, and the other will be for those values that were unpivoted, such as your sales metrics. And this will also retain all of the non-unpivoted columns in the output. So all the other columns that are there will also be included. So for example, if we have columns like Q1 sales, Q2 sales, and such, when we unpivot this, we'll have 2 columns, one for that quarter and one for the sales. So here, as an example here, we see that before on pivot table, we can see we have 4 columns, each one for the sales of the quarters. And then when we do a pivot, we'll see that now, instead of having those 4 columns, we have 2 columns, one for quarter and one for sales. And one thing to note here, just as mentioned, we're going from the wide data into a longer format. So here we have more rows than what we previously had. Okay. So when should we use unpivot? The ideal scenarios here will be for when we have column-oriented data, meaning all your data is spread across multiple columns. For example, like we just saw, where each Q1 sales was represented into a different column. when we want to do any time series analysis, converting these period-based columns into a single day period column typically is more suited and easier to work with when we're creating these time series analysis, as well as when we're working with forecast data transformation. So if that forecast data is stored in that column-oriented structure, we're going to want to transform that with the unpivoted. And just as mentioned, for visualization preparation, this helps make the data suitable for charts that do require that long format data, and then it's typically easier to work with when analyzing and visualization. Okay. And then the last one here is just combining with historical data. So typically when we have historical data that is kind of archived or analyzed together, it may be stored in that column-oriented format just to save on the data space and size. So typically we want to normalize forecast data as well as possibly even the historical data. That way we can create that. And as an example here for a real-world use case, think of like a regional analyst transforming column-oriented forecast data into a normalized format that can be combined with historical sales for year-over-year analysis. Okay, so when should we not want to use the unpivot? Well, the first is when the data is already in normalized, it's already in that long format with proper row structure. Then we shouldn't and we don't need to unpivot this data. Another scenario would be when we have incompatible data types. So if the columns that you want to unpivot have different data types, we may not want to, or perhaps we can't unpivot those columns. We may do a first step before that, as they all must have compatible data types. The unpivot is a SPICE only feature, so this will not be available for direct query data sets. So if real-time data is required, if you can go ahead and click one more time, if real-time data is required and we need the direct query, the unpivot won't be available. And then lastly, sometimes the wide format, as Andy mentioned, the wide format is preferred and needed. So if your analysis specifically requires the data in the wide format, as an example, we're doing the comparison tables, then we may not want to unpivot that data. And then one important constraint that I do want to call out that I mentioned before is that the row count typically does increase significantly after unpivoting. So this may impact performance for very large data sets. So when we're working with big data or large data that we may need to unpivot, we may want to factor in the data size and maybe take extracts or smaller data sets of that. That way we can work with that. Okay. Now I'm going to bring up a demo here. Okay. So just because I'll just kind of peeking at the questions here a little bit, I'll go ahead and start with how to create the data set, which is quickly when we are looking at Quick Suite, we can click on the data sets here on the left side and then hit create data set, where in this example, I will be uploading a file. So we can click upload file and I will click on my region sales CSV. Okay. Once we get to this step, I'm going to select edit settings and prepare data, which will bring us into this new data prep experience. I'm going to expand this button here where we can see all of the different transformations and steps that we have available to us. So if I wanted to add an additional data set, you can hit add, as well as add any calculated columns, rename, and select, like we'll be showing here in a bit. So this is my regional sales CSV. As we can see, we have a columns for revenue per month, as well as with units per month here. So in order to work with this, typically we're going to want to unpivot these. Since we have two metrics here, I'm going to go down the route of doing unpivot twice here. So we're going to do one unpivot for revenue and one unpivot for units. Now, this isn't the only path or only solution to do this, but for the purpose of this demo, we will be going that route with multiple unpivots. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to do a select column here. And the reason why I want to do this is just for simplicity. And you can see when working through the steps, we'll only be focusing on the columns that we are unpivoting at this moment. So we're going to start off with the revenue. Okay. So we can see here with the select that now my data for this step is only showing those revenue columns that we want to unpivot. And I'm going to go ahead and add that unpivot step. And once we're here, we can just simply select the columns that we want to unpivot. So as mentioned, this is going to create two rows. And this is asking us now for that header, what do we want that value to be in our columns? For here, I'm just simply going to remove that underscore revenue and just keep the year-date combination that we have. Okay. And we're going to call the column for that, for that month-year combination they have. For that column, I'm going to go ahead and call that month. And we'll call the values, we're going to call that column revenue. So I'm going to hit the preview button, and then we can see that we now have our month broken out into one column, as well as our revenue values in one column as well. So we've unpivoted those revenue columns. And now we're ready to do the same for the unit columns. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to go back to my first step here with the change data by type 1. And I'm actually going to then add another select columns here. So here is that feature where we say where we can divergence. We can have additional paths here. So I'm going to create a new path here. And in this one, we'll be working with the units columns. And similarly, we'll then select just those units. Then we'll do the unpivot for the units columns here. And then similarly, we'll go ahead and name month, and we'll name the columns units. Okay, so now I have my data here for the units column, and we have it in gray format. So now that I have my both data sets or my both columns here unpivoted, I can now join them together to create our final data set. So here we're just going to go ahead and select unpivot 2. So we're going to be joining our both unpivot for revenue as well as for units. And we want to be sure we are joining on that region ID, manager, and that month value. Okay. So here we have our data now, and we can see we have our data joined with all our dimensions as well as our two metrics, revenue and units. And if we wanted to further clean this up, we can go ahead and do the select columns, followed by any renaming that we want to do. So for here, I'm just going to select one set of our dimensions as well as our two metrics for our data set. And then once we're ready, we can then go ahead and save and publish, as well as hit save and publish and visualize to get to start working on our final visualization. And for that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the demo here.